The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
We got tanks up there. Let's follow a radio on Detroit. I'm doing out right on the target right now. I've got a submarine right in front of me. I'm going after it. Right there, got him.
Welcome back to the Elite Pursuit Podcast. Yes, we do listen to you all. You've made fun of us for not talking enough about books, for not showing how learned, erudite, and smart we are, which, if you know us, you know we're not. Well, tonight we're going to talk to Steve Dixon again, but we're going to talk about a book. We're going to talk about Keeping the Peace, his book about VMFA 251 during the Cold War. Steve, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well.
It's good to have you back on the
Doug.
podcast. Well, let's talk a little bit about history. So this is a shift from the last time we talked, which was about wargaming. So we know your background as a wargamer. Give us your background as an author. How did you end up writing a squadron history during the Cold War?
Well, it started in 2013. There was, when I served with the squadron in the 70s, there's no history written of the squadron, and they've been around since 1941. Right. So in 2013, I applied for a grant with the USMC Heritage Foundation, saying I'd like to write the squadron history of World War II from 41 to 45. Well, lo and behold, I got the grant. They said, tag your
Congrats, now finish it.
Yeah, and talking with my contact up there, he said, you applied for the grant at the right time because the Commandant of the Marine Corps had come down with an order wanting all squadron histories updated. And I just happened to fall in right at that time, and they tagged me, and 3 years later, VMO 251, Photo Recon became Fighter Duty, was published in 2016. So I applied for another grant to continue the history from 46 to 91, got the grant, and book was finally published in March of this year, after about 4 or 5 years of writing it and fighting COVID.
Yeah. Well, it
was a challenge.
Everyone thinks history is easy. You just get a bunch of sources, you sit back and you take it all and you throw it together in kind of a soup sandwich, and out comes a book. But reading through the book, it's always funny to me where you can tell how much hard work went to having to dig into history that wasn't written down very well. And I'll pick on our predecessors as Marines. The guys, and you even bring it up in the book, there was a time when command chronologies weren't mandatory. And if nothing happened, they might not have taken very good records.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was, I was surprised when I found out from the Marine Corps History Division that they weren't required unless the unit was in combat. But that finally changed in 65, where everybody had to file them once every 6 months. Yeah,
that was the bane of my existence as a young lieutenant. Congratulations, you're the command chronology officer. Oh, thanks, XO. That's awesome.
They call them historians now.
Yeah, there was no glory to it. It was, congrats, you're the command chronology officer. Here's your other crappy little jobs we're going to give you. CGI coordinator, so you get to coordinate the commanding general's inspections and all those. Yeah, the fun of being a boot lieutenant. Yeah. But anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about your background on it. So obviously you were in VMFA 251, so you've got a little bit of background with the squadron and a little bit of skin in the game as being a patch wearer of a T-bolt. I won't sneer at that. Actually, I have a lot of friends that were T-bolts, a lot of good friends, so I can't say much. But there's also a little bit of a kind of weighty responsibility, not just being a former squadron member, but realizing that you're writing something for the Marine Corps' history of this unit, because strangely, and I don't know why the Marine Corps is this way. It's probably tells you something about how administratively challenged we are. There are well-decorated and impressive units that have had almost nothing written about them. from their inception. So.
Yes, yeah, and I'm glad to finally have a chance to fill in that hole.
Well, I kind of chuckle a little bit because the way you wrote the book, you obviously allude to what you've written previously with some of the World War II history about VMO 251 and the things they did. And then you obviously cover some at the very end about what happens after 1991. But the period that you had to cover was both at times really interesting and at times excruciatingly boring.
Oh, absolutely. It was training for what ifs.
How was that as a historian to dig through? Did you ever sit there and go, why did I bite off this large chunk of years?
Well, I wanted to cover the Cold War, but like you said, there was times where I shook my head and said, how am I going to reword this? Umpteen million times, and unfortunately, that's the way it was. And I just tried to do the best I could with what I had.
I chuckled because I could tell that at one point where I think for the third time in a row, you're like, and during this period, the squadron had no mishaps, lost no aircraft, and and you're like, there's nothing I can say. They did their job. They flew these exercises, these training missions, and did a good job. So
yeah. And as the years progressed, the accidents kept falling off, which is a good thing. The safety programs that we alluded to in our previous podcast kind of worked itself in, and now I'm working on the final years of the third volume of the squadron history. They're even less.
And I think that's something a lot of people don't understand about, especially naval aviation, Navy and Marine Corps aviation, and jet aviation in particular, is how dangerous it was at the beginning and how there were some very specific policies or programs instituted that helped that safety record. We used to laugh whenever we look at the statistics, because of course you can always make statistics lie. The Navy was fond of overlaying their favorite programs with, each one of the reductions in mishaps. Like at this point, when we introduced, naval operations standard procedures, the NATOPS program, look how much the mishap rate dropped. Angled carrier decks, it dropped here. One of my safety school instructors showed the same slide and showed his career overlaid with it. And he's like, oh, look, when I became a lieutenant, the mishap rate dropped. Here I was promoted to major, the mishap rate dropped again, So statistics lie and liars use statistics, or whatever the old saying is. But I think it's an interesting part of your book, and I in a sense like this, and maybe it's because I was a safety officer and I'm a safety nerd. But it was fascinating for me to go through and to look at the records of the mishaps and the lost aircraft, and to really be able to see how that changed over time. And how, yes, aviation was still dangerous, but aviation did become safer. And whether through policy, leadership, whatever, there was a positive direction in the overall mishap rate, because it was horrific at the beginning of jet aviation.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely, especially with the Skyraiders that they flew.
Well, I did get one laugh out of there because it reminded me of a lot of stories I'd heard, was that when you see the same pilot on there for multiple mishaps, and you realize, that was a different era. You could go crash a plane and 2 weeks later take it up again and crash it again, and walk away. As long as you walked away from both of them, who knows, you might still be in a flight status.
Yeah, unfortunately, there was a few that didn't walk away. There were,
and that is something a lot of people may not even realize about the early ages of U.S. military aviation, was that the op tempo was excruciatingly high, and there was not time to learn from your mistakes. And so a lot of times, you might have come back and had a mishap, and you were back in the air within a day or 2 days, and you might not even know why you crashed the plane the last time. The instructor might have said something to you, or your flight lead might have said, don't ever do that again. And that wasn't the causal factor. So there's a number of aviators I saw in the book that listings with that, they did not survive their second time through with the mishap. So, but that I think is part of the story of the Cold War that gets lost for a lot of people, is they think of the Cold War as they either think of, the hot conflicts that were out there of Korea and Vietnam, but they don't think about all the other carrier operations, high op tempo forward deployed operations, where there was no shooting, but there were people crashing and dying, and that was a
Right.
definitely a tough part of the Cold War. Was it interesting to you to kind of dig into the operations that you had not been a part of for 251, and to get to see the different things they were tapped to do?
Well, as the years progressed, I found it interesting. The equipment changes, especially with the different when they started flying MPQ missions in Korea, and they hadn't really been trained to do that, so they kind of learned on the fly, flying those Sky Raiders. And I was talking to my old electrician, my work center boss, in our last reunion, and he knew fully well. He looked at me and said, "MPQ missions, God, like those, But and they kept flying them, but they didn't really do a whole lot with it. I mean, granted, you had these radars guiding you to the target, but it didn't do any good if you couldn't see what the hell you were hitting. They still had to verify what you hit, but they couldn't do it 90% of the time because it was either in the dark or it was too cloudy to see what was going on. But they kept doing it. That's what they had to do. But that was one of the things I found interesting. I think
there's a lot of people that don't even understand. I mean, they understand how like strategic bombing worked and how some of the later Vietnam attack missions kind of went on. But I think a lot of people don't always appreciate that as technology advanced, there still were a lot of times, in a sense, we were flying and fighting blind. We might have had a fancier system, but you still didn't know the effect of your attack, or you had to have bomb damage assessment done later in clear weather, good weather, and that you just went and flew the mission and you came back and there wasn't necessarily an emotional reward at the end of it that, hey, we hit the target. You're like, hey, we dropped some bombs. We did a mission. We went out and sortied. I mean, it's like all the night fighter guys. We went out, we sortied. I think we shot some guys down. Something blew up out there. But it's not the same as getting into a dogfight in the middle of the day.
Yeah, well, I did find also another fact that reading Korean War history, especially in Marine aviation, when they talk about 251, it's like they struck targets, near the DMZ at the time. Well, they did, but they also struck a lot of targets in North Korea in those last several weeks of the war before the armistice was signed. And so they had targets all over the place they were hitting at that time, which I found interesting. But again, didn't really know what they were hitting.
And there's a lot of parts of tactical aviation that are, even that way, where people are like, yeah, we hit a truck park if it's, Vietnam. If it's Operation Southern Watch, they're like, we hit a cable repeater, I think. If it's, Iraqi freedom, they're like, yeah, we hit some tanks and revetments, I think, And so there may not be necessarily a knowledge of specifically what you went out and you hit. We've talked about it in the podcast before, my background as we talked about last time, a big A, little F guy. Words mean things, and I always tell people aviators absolutely suck at bomb damage assessment. I don't really know what I damaged. I know I dropped some bombs at this location, and I can tell you bomb hit assessment. I can tell you something blew up and something was pouring black smoke, but I don't necessarily know what it was or how much I damaged it. I don't know. Was it destroyed? It was smoking. So it's interesting how, and it's probably mostly from the Gulf War, Gulf War I, and the perceptions thereof, and video games where people are like, oh yeah, you're going to know immediately if you destroy the target. I'm like, nah, it's not that way. More than once I dropped my bombs. I'm like, did they dud or did they go high order? Did that actually work? So it's being a historian, I'm sure you found a lot of times there were inconclusive mission reports, that it was hard to really characterize what the squadron had done because there was nothing there. And there was no follow-up intel or BDA done.
Exactly. Yeah. It was tough. So I did the best I could with the information I had. And what made it even tougher was most of the places that I had to go to for research or contact were all closed because of COVID. So, so most of my research had to be done over the internet, and you got to be careful with that. So I went with what I had. At some point, I had to start writing. I could go forever on research, but I had to say, no, I got to stop and start getting words to paper. So
How helpful was the Marine Corps in this, in the sense of, did they dump a bunch of command chronologies on you and say, good luck, go forth, do good things? Or
well, I had a problem with locating the targets for the Korean War missions. I found a map, and I'm used to the Army system since I'm involved a lot with my grandfather's Army division from World War II, so I can read their maps when it comes to their reports. But the mapping system was different, so I had an idea, so I sent what I had to the USMC History Division. Am I reading these maps right? About a day or two later, they came back and said, yeah, you got it right, and here's how it works.
That's funny.
So I said, phew. So now that's how I was able to pinpoint the targets with the map that I had and the targets and the coordinates given to me in the action reports.
Yeah.
Those were thorough, except for the type of targets they were hitting. They were
Right.
rarely mentioned.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
they probably didn't know.
I laugh because, and I think I've told the story on the podcast before, you can get into so much trouble into what you accidentally mistype in a mission report, or Intel mistypes for you and they transpose coordinates, and suddenly everyone wants to accuse you of being the war criminal that bombed the orphanage off the target. You're like, no, I'm pretty sure I bombed the right target, and you go back and trace it back to being a mistyped coordinate in the report.
Yeah.
So there's human error and all that makes it tough on historians and tough to go back through and piecemeal what really happened out there. And we've said it a number of times in the podcast, is that I don't even think, even if you could get the whole accurate real story, that isn't the story you tell as historians. I mean, there's a point where you have to relate what people thought they did and what people thought their mission success was, and vice versa. What was the impact to the enemy? Because sometimes it doesn't matter if you hit your intended target. Whatever you hit might have been more valuable, or might have been that central node of the enemy's resupply convoy or whatever. So I think there's a lot of times we search for that perfect answer as historians, that in a sense kind of leaves everything cold. It doesn't really tell the rest of the story.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
yeah. But
no, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. At least I think in the third volume I'll have a better perspective. There's a lot more people around that have lived through the events in the last 28 years. So I got several interviews lined up that I'll be conducting with squadron commanders.
That's
over
frightening.
The years.
I probably know several of them.
Yeah, and I'll have more action to cover because they were involved in Bosnia. They were involved in Iraq and involved in Afghanistan. So as I'm looking through the command chronologies when it comes to Afghanistan and Iraq, lo and behold, I find the annexes missing to the chronologies that listed missions, targets, bomb load, and results. Those are all gone. I said, great. Well, I'll have to ask do you know where they are? So in the meantime, I filed freedom of information requests to try to get this information from different sources. So we'll see what happens.
It's interesting as stuff that was classified is now handled out and piecemealed out for some of these things. It's funny how much of it's discussed and how much isn't. I know when you read the official Marine Corps history for the initial operations in Afghanistan for Operation Enduring Freedom, it's funny the things that are directly discussed in there, and then there are things that there's almost no information put out about. So will obviously be a challenge there. I do know that there's a lot of really good stories from 251 from those eras. They dropped for me in Afghanistan, so it's kind of funny the different interactions we all had out there, because between them and 314, they gave a lot of good support to our MU that was out there at the opening phases of Operation Enduring Freedom. So it's kind of funny, the small world that comes up when you start having historians dig through those things. You're like, wait a minute, I know this guy's name.
Right.
So that's good.
Yep. Yeah, it is a small
and
world.
The Marine Corps especially is a super close knit community. It's good to have Marines writing the history for Marines. I have a couple other good friends that are not Marines that do a lot of the aviation history, and they're very good. Guys like Joe Kopelman, they're awesome with their historical perspectives of marine aviation. But it's just so funny because there's times that they call me up and they're like, I really don't understand why you guys either A, do something this way, or B, why did you write it this way? And I have to explain either marine speak or, the way we do business, which is sometimes counterintuitive for historians to dig through. And of course, like everything else, as Marines, we suck at admin. So we take terrible notes. So,
I find it surprising that they don't have the command chronologies for like 2018 to 2020, and that's the years when things were winding down and finally deactivated in April of 2020. So I have nothing basically for the last 4 or 5 years. So I'll just do the best I can.
That's the tough thing is I think as squadrons get closer to deactivation and op tempos change and things, that sometimes that administrative stuff slips through the cracks and you end up not having some key historical data that's right before the squadron went into cadre status or was disestablished. So sometimes it's unfortunate.
I think the thing throughout the book, I found it pretty heartening that they were able to accomplish all their missions despite all the problems that they had supply-wise or personnel-wise. They found a way to get the job done, and I'm sure most other units did it too, but that's what you had to do, but they were able to do it, and they did it well.
And I think that's one of the interesting stories of marine aviation is, as you've lived, I've lived, that there's always a feeling that somebody else has had fewer airplanes, fewer maintainers, and less gas to get the mission accomplished. So you better get it accomplished with all the stuff we gave you.
Right.
That the Marines will always do more with less, but we also kind of shame our own people into the fact that people have done amazing work in the Marine Corps and don't let anyone else down. So there's obviously a lot of that in this book. There's a lot that I enjoyed flipping through and reading, because even though it wasn't necessarily super exciting stories of hey, here's this mission they did over this location. There's a lot dealing with those challenges and dealing with just how hard it is to manage a fighter squadron, with all the op tempo, with the forward deployments, and changing of aircraft, because that's the other piece that you talk about in there is that's not an inconsequential piece. It's not like you just go read the manual the next day and go jump in an airplane, although that's pretty much how they did it in the 1950s. There are times that they would have to stand down the squadron. They'd send replacement pilots off somewhere and slowly get a trickle of new replacement pilots in to figure out how to employ the new aircraft. And that alone is to me an interesting story. And maybe it's just because you and I come out of that kind of an era of transition of aircraft. I think a lot of people think it's painless, it's simple, it happens overnight, and there's a lot of work that goes on there.
It takes time. It takes time.
Yeah,
it does.
I know. Watching the F-35 transition in Beaufort as the F-18 squadron started to go away, there was a lot of interesting things that went on, a lot of hard work to make that seamless. And I'm sure it was the same thing when it was the Phantoms to F-18s. No different, because it was culturally a different airplane. It was an electronic jet. It was not a big hydromechanical beast that you could hit with a big hammer. So there's that story. I think is an interesting part of marine aviation, is the change in kind of the aircraft we flew and what those how we maintained them. And you even allude to that a little bit in the book, just with how things changed between the different aircraft and the way the challenges the squadrons had.
I know that at my time working on Phantoms from 76 to 79, there always seemed to be a part shortage, supply shortage. So you're always robbing Peter to pay Paul to get planes flying, and then you usually had your hangar queen sitting inside, and then once you got the parts in, you could get the hangar queen out of the hangar.
I was laughing as soon as I read that section in the book, and I sat there and I'm like, oh, shocking! It's marine aviation. Yeah. I'm sure a lot of other
not even. It's probably everybody that it went through it. It seems to be endemic. I'm sure the F-35s are going to have their share of it.
It's
too.
unfortunately goes back to the mission accomplishment piece. We can either sit around and wait for supply to find us the part, or we can rip apart the hangar queen, and that part may be 3 levels deep in the airplane, and we're going to have to farm a bunch of other things to get to that part, but we're going to do it. We're going to get those parts. Yeah.
But over the years, though, they did their job, and there was a couple instances like I didn't know at the time when 251 got sent to Iwakuni for a year in '77. I didn't realize at the time that was the first unit deployment program.
And I didn't realize y'all were the first one either. And that was interesting to read. I was like, oh wow, that's new. I didn't.
And we were originally supposed to be there 6 months, but of course, in the research, I found out there was engine problems, and that caused a delay. So we had to stay out there a year until they got that straightened out. So it was interesting to know. Find out. But that rough period after they won the Hansen Trophy in '69 and then into the early '70s is something, and I never could really pinpoint it. Things went downhill with the squadron, and they lost 2 aircraft. The morale was low, and then that change of command. And talking with Lieutenant Colonel Mavretic, who was in the middle of it and ended up taking over the squadron. Boy, he had his work cut out for him to turn the squadron around.
I've actually lived through that in a squadron, and that's a story that I think is one of those things you can't really do justice to as a historian, because there's so much interpersonal interaction and so much behind the scenes that goes on to take a squadron that's, for whatever reason, is having a rough go of it. And when a new CO comes in and kind of realizes where the problems are, and either has to A, clean house, or B, just get people back in the game and back playing at the highest levels, then there's just a lot that you really can't write about that. It would be purely an interview with one guy about what he thought he did right or wrong, and everyone else would be like, yeah, the guy was great, or he was the worst CO ever,
Yeah. As one pilot said, those weren't the best of times with the squadron.
And I think most Marine squadrons, you'll go through that at some time. I know, looking back at my years in 533, we were always a really fortunate squadron. We always got stacked with super high quality Marines, super high quality aviators. So we kind of cheated that, but we even had our dark days, and especially had them right before Operation Iraqi Freedom. But it is also amazing with Marines that you can change the leadership of a squadron and it will change the performance overnight. And it's something about Marines, and Marines respond to a challenge. They respond to from the front kind of leadership, and you put those people in a squadron and stuff gets done, So it's good to read about that in the book, and also to read about the fact that I guess it's good for me to read and realize that squadrons had rough times too, that even, I may make fun of 251, but 251 is one of those really high quality squadrons that me as a D guy, I've always looked up to them as single seat guys because they've always helped me out. They've always been at the top of their game. But it's good to read a history where you realize, hey, they had years they struggled too. They had times that things did not go their way for whatever reason, that all squadrons go through that in their history, and the good ones pick up the pieces and go on.
Well, 251 did. They had Mavretic that turned things around, and he held it for about a year and a half, and then passed it on to the next commander, and he carried forth with the same program, and they worked themselves out of a hole.
Well, what are some of your favorite stories there? I mean, obviously, it probably was fun to go back as a historian and hear the rest of what was around your time frame, because, like you alluded to, the changes to the unit deployment program and bringing aircraft over for the first time. What were some of the other things that either were an eye opener or you were super excited to dig in on?
Well, the first one. I served with the Captain Clulo, who was a Rio, but I didn't realize that he had been with the squadron for a couple of years earlier than I had, 2 or 3 years. And and I touch upon it in the book, where he was involved in an accident in Texas, nearly killed him. Pilot lost control of the aircraft in a crosswind, and and he crashed. I didn't know this. I found this all out trying to track him down to interview him, and come to find out he's two miles down the road from where I live. He's in the same town. So I went over to his house, and we spent the afternoon. I interviewed him, and he said, "Oh, I got something for you." And he came back with his logbook and the pictures of the scene of the accident, about 20 of them.
Wow.
And I'm going through them, and there's a few of them in the book that are in there. And that plane there was nothing left of that plane. It was a miracle those two guys survived. And he took about 18 months before he came back to the squadron before his leg healed up.
Yeah.
So it was just amazing. I didn't even know that about
that's always interesting to get the back history on people that you have a personal connection with. I know there's been recently a couple times that I've been able to read unit histories or read kind of event histories and get stories on people that I'd flown with and people that I knew that I didn't know what they did before I joined the squadron. And it was never really talked about, but people that had flown in the Bosnia missions before me and things like that. And to read some of the accounts and for me to laugh and go, I know that guy.
Yeah. And Colonel Mavretic, he sent me a picture of all the officers in the squadron at the time he was relinquished command to the next incoming commander. And I'm looking at the pictures and I know that guy. I know that guy because they all went on to serve and we all went to Iwakuni together. So, and I tracked down one of them, Poppleshaw, who's in, I think, Pennsylvania. And he was involved in a slight mishap in Iwakuni. And a buddy of mine thought it was a nose wheel problem. I said, I don't think so. And he had a bird strike and he came in. So, yeah. So anyway, it was fun tracking down some guys I hadn't heard from in 40 years. That's
cool. I think we're spoiled these days with the way social media is because for me, it's funny. I still stay in touch with a lot of the Marines that I was in the squadron with, both officer and enlisted. And it's just funny because I now realize that if any one of us wants to go back and try to put things together, contacting people isn't going to be the hard part. Getting them to sit down and tell you the story might be the tough part, but I laugh about it. And even I think for some of the Marines that I've served with, it's kind of funny to go out and see on social media every once in a while the things we talk about now that we kind of bring back Facebook memories or bring up photos of when we were on deployment or whatever, that you would never see. You would never see these kind of things in the era before social media. And as much as I may like to say terrible things about social media, there's times that I've seen people share photos that I'm like, I didn't know those photos existed, or I'll see, at times some of the gunnies and mash sergeants I work with, I see really young Lance Corporal Jones, I see these photos that their wife shares, on their birthday. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that photo existed. So it's, that's one of the good things for social media, especially in the military environment. And for me I'm definitely not a historian. I'm a amateur historian at best. But it's cool to go back and to dig through and see the rest of the story. I forget which one of my Marines it was, but they were posting photos from when we deployed to Tazar, Hungary for Operation Allied Force. And I have photos taken at the same time, but from different locations. And so it's just funny, so it's me taking photos. My photos are taken as I was walking to the aircraft and getting ready to go fly. And this Marine was out on the line taking photos of the same people, same cranials. And I'm laughing because I recognize the names on cranials and everything, but it's literally the same event taken from two different perspectives. So it's cool to dig up things like that now with social media, aside from all the BS on social media, all the crap you have to dig through. Yeah. What were some of your other favorite parts putting the book together?
I wouldn't call it favorite, but I found it the most interesting was compiling the accidents. The information behind the accidents. And I had to file a Freedom of Information request through the Navy to get those accident reports.
I wish I nearly spit out my coffee when I was reading through the introduction and said, and I got information from the Naval Safety Center. I'm like, I can't get information from the Naval Safety Center. And I work inside safety programs. So good. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you got.
Well, it was a double-edged sword. Yeah, I got the reports, but the meat of what I wanted to find out, the cause of the accident,
I was about to say in most cases they probably
these.
redacted that out of it. Yeah.
I said, you got to be kidding me. So so I did the best I could. And one I was especially interested in was it involved two officers that I knew, Martha, Johnny, and Hill. I was discharged in June of '79, and in September of '79, the squadron had deployed to Yuma, and they were killed in an accident during a simulated dogfight. And reading the accident reports, it wasn't their fault. I don't know of the official ruling on that, but there was problems with that aircraft. It had been worked on at NARF, been reworked and updated, and apparently there were some issues with the NARF work.
Well,
and that may have led to the engine
absolutely.
failure.
And it's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people, well, I shouldn't say I think, I know, because I get in arguments with some very good friends of mine that are in aviation, but not from a true full aviation background, like you and I are, and they don't understand the level of candor that is in really the true mishap report. Not what's published, not what's sent to the press, not what's given to the families, and all those reports are for all different purposes. But the level of candor in a Navy and Marine Corps mishap report is usually extremely high. And that's also kind of the reason they sometimes get redacted, because the intent is to call it as it is and say exactly what failed, why it failed, and how to get better. And that's not always something you want to read. I mean, I know the mishaps that I unfortunately had to be the safety officer on, that there's times that you don't want you hate having to call out mistakes that your buddies or that your friends made, but you don't want people to make the same mistake again. And so that level of candor in naval aviation is huge. And I know obviously the Air Force has their own variant of it. They do things slightly differently than the Navy and Marine Corps for their mishap reporting. But for people who've never actually dug through a real Naval Safety Center mishap report, you would be amazed at the level of detail it goes into about the maintenance on the aircraft, the logbooks on the aircraft. What did the air crew eat the day before? Did they get any sleep? And so we're used to seeing that kind of stuff. But
the inspection of the debris, that was. I said, "Holy cow!" I'm reading all that stuff. But okay, I get to the assessment and you see a big black box there. So what can you do?
Yeah. And I can understand why the Marine Corps or the Naval Safety Center undoubtedly did some of those things there. I think by law, they're constrained about some of that, but it's, I think when you get to read through those reports, it's really a peek behind the curtain into naval aviation. And you realize that, we used to always talk about the Swiss cheese methodology. There's 10,000 things that can go wrong. You just don't want enough of them to line up that it causes a mishap. And you really get to see that in a lot of those reports. All right. Well, anything else you really want to cover in the history of the book? I know it's kind of it's a bridge. It's going between your first effort with the World War II history and then following on into the 91 and beyond era. But anything you really want to draw out of the book?
No, not really. Anybody can find it on any bookstore, online or brick and mortar store. And you can order it through the publisher.
Absolutely. Go look for Keeping the Peace. And it's a history of VMFA 251 in the Cold War years. Where can people contact you on the internet?
Well, they can contact me through my website at stephenkdixon.com.
Awesome. That's the easiest way to get in touch with you, and drop you a line there, fill out the comment sheets and say, here's my question, or here's some other interesting information I have. What are your plans besides writing about 251? Any other topics or any other book ideas burning through your brain right now that you can share at least? No, not right now. My goal is to finish the third volume, and then on top of that, doing my other game designs. So I got enough to keep me busy for the next couple of years. That's probably a good thing. Keeps us all off the streets and out of trouble. Well, awesome.
Yep.
Well, Steve, thanks for talking to us tonight. I really appreciate it. It's always good to talk about books and not just about games and pushing cardboard counters or little miniature airplanes around, but to talk about a lot of the research and the information that goes into building a good history and a detailed history, not just kind of a cursory look at the operations of a squadron. So it was funny for me to read Keeping the Peace, but it was also realizing that you had done a heck of a lot of work with command chronologies and other documents, because it has that level of detail, which is really good for me to see in a book. So thanks for writing it. I really appreciate it. I know all the T-bolts out there will be appreciative as well.
Well, thank you. So, yeah. So I hope it sells well. I'll find out when I get my first royalty check.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hopefully people here on the podcast will go out and check it out. And then as you start working through the next book for the T-bolts, then they'll support you there as well. So thanks for being on the podcast. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.
Well, I'd like to remind all of our listeners to go out and like and support the podcast, review us, tell other people how terrible we are. We are the worst historians, and you should never listen to our podcast, because strangely, all the people that like the podcast say that's what they heard from their buddies. So anyway, don't believe your friends. Listen to us and like and review us, and we will talk to you in the future. So keep climbing for advantage.